Hi everyone, it's my pleasure to be with you for this second weekly lecture of risk and compliance. For lots of complicated reasons, I can unfortunately not be with you directly in person this week. And for this reason, we are making a good use of technology. You will have a video lecture with, of course, a reading list and a PowerPoint. So we are flipping the classroom. You are doing this at home, on your own time, at the library, wherever you want. You have the liberty to take your time and go through the lecture at your own rhythm. And of course, through the use of the same technology, you may also contact me with any questions you have, any remarks, or any particular query about this second lecture or about anything else. Of course, as you know, I am open to communication. You may remember that last week we have spoken about risk and compliance, of course, as an introduction to this semester of lectures, but also we dived in compliance and risk by looking at strategies and processes. Now, this is what we're going to deepen this week, and we are going to spend a little bit more time discussing compliance processes, compliance strategies, including by looking back at what we've done in the last weekly lecture together to try and get a little bit more out of the case study we have worked on. So if you move on to slide 2 of our PowerPoint, you can see the program for today, which is essentially 3 parts: how to design processes first, the dangers of focusing on processes, right, the limits, and finally compliance as a goal. Before we go any further, I must clarify here that to get the most out of this lecture, you are supposed to have done the weekly readings. It's 10 documents, 9 of them are texts, 1 is a short video, document 2, a TED Talk. So if you haven't done so, you may now pause the recording and look at the syllabus for this week, in which there are links embedded into today's agenda, but also at the end of the syllabus, a summary list of these 10 documents for today. It should take you about 1 hour to review these documents, go through them, and make sure that you come prepared for this lecture and that you are in a position to get the most out of it and to really fully understand what is it that we are talking about. If you have done the reading and if you are ready for this lecture, we will now get started, and I'm asking you to move to slide 3, which is a reminder of the case study we have done last week. You remember POBO, the Prevention of Bribery Ordinance, Section 8 tells us that we are not supposed to bribe government officers. Of course, it says this in slightly legalistic terms and says any person who, without any lawful authority or reasonable excuse, while having dealings with any kind with the government through any department, office or establishment of the government, offers any advantage to any prescribed officer employed in that department, office or establishment of the government, shall be guilty of an offence. Now, we discussed this. If you move to slide 4, you may remember that we have said this is not a very useful piece of legislation for the people who are really trying to comply with it. It might be very clear for a lawyer, might be very clear for a compliance officer, for someone who is accustomed to complying with anti-corruption regulation, but for someone who, for instance, works at a construction company and has no knowledge or understanding of the rules, we need to put that in simpler terms. And that pushed us to think about the role of the compliance officer as a translator, someone who takes the language, puts it in more simple language, or someone who takes the language and does something else with it. So for instance, a decision chart. This is what we have done in slide 5, and you remember we have done that together last week. We put this in a decision chart, which allows you to start laying out a strategy and a process, the 2 subjects of today, to comply with Section 8 of the POBO. Are you doing business with government? No, you're not concerned. Yes, you may not offer anything of value to anyone working in the department you are doing business with. Now here we are. We went from a fairly complicated, long sentence put in the legislation, and we turned this into a more useful, more agile more practical compliance strategy and compliance process for someone who has to comply with Section 8. If you want to move with me to Section 6, we will now start by looking at the first topic for today, which is how to design processes. What we're going to do here, we're going to look back at what we've done last week with the short 3-slide reminder we just had about creating a chart starting from a piece of legislation, and we're going to try and get slightly more out of it. We're going to try and take that and extract what is it that we've done, and are there rules and principles and things to avoid that can be extracted from this process. A, who is your audience? Now, of course, this is the question we put first, and we decided to start with A, who is your audience, because it often should be the first thing you think about when you move towards a compliance process or a compliance strategy. Please look at slide number 7. We've highlighted one part of Section 8 POBO, which is any person. Your audience is any person in that case. The LegCo member or the executive member who drafted Section 8 of the POBO wrote for any person. Now you really have to stop for a second and think like a lawyer. A person can be an individual, like you, like me, a physical person. But a person can also be a company, an association of undertakings, meaning, for instance, a trade association, so not even a company, but simply a registered society. This can also be a person, right? Now, think about it for a second and assume that instead of a person working in the construction industry, for instance, the purchaser, or someone who's in charge of tendering, or someone who is a marketing officer for a construction company, you are dealing inside of the same construction company with the CEO. The chief executive officer of the company is your audience. Assume that for a second. Would your compliance strategy and process still work? Well, it needs to be adapted because you now need to think about who's your audience and what does that mean. If you move to slide number 8, you will realize that when I ask, are you doing business with government? And the person you're asking this to is the CEO of the company, the question is the company doing business with government? Because the chief executive officer is the officer of the entire company. The chief executive officer has the power to engage the responsibility of the entire company. So when you're asking this person, are you doing with government? You're effectively asking the entire company, are you doing business with government? That triggers a whole series of questions. What if the CEO doesn't have all that information available when you're asking the question? You're asking the CEO, are you doing business with government? And the CEO doesn't know. He or she doesn't necessarily have that information available. Am I doing business with government immediately in the last 3 months? Any government? Each department of government? Does the CEO know what every single person in the company is doing? Well, if it's a small company with 10, 12 people, maybe. If it's a giant construction company in Hong Kong, such as Henderson, Hong Kong Land, we are talking about dozens of thousands of people. The CEO may not know what every person is doing, so that person may not be able to answer the question. Worse, you may not have clarified when you asked the CEO, are you doing business with government, that the CEO was in effect to answer in the name of the company. And the CEO might be tempted to answer, no, I'm not doing business with government at the moment because the projects I am involved in personally concern other third parties, private construction companies, and we are simply a subcontractor, right? Well, your question was about the company, and the CEO answers you because you said you, so this person may not have thought about that. This is also your job as a compliance officer to think about who is your audience and to clarify it for yourself, but also for the person who is going to answer your questions and has to comply with laws and regulations. If you want to move with me to slide number 8, we have here the second part of our how to design processes. And what I really wanted to put here is something that really makes you think about your job. What is it that you're trying to do? Not two compliance officers are doing the same thing. Some of them are simply trying to catch people who are cheating. We will discuss later in this lecture financial organizations such as hedge funds, where there are people spying inside the organization, listening to phone calls, reading emails, reading chat room messages and WhatsApp messages, and trying to catch people currently trying to cheat. Is this what you're trying to do? This will dramatically impact the compliance strategy that you take and the compliance processes that you put in place, that you create and that you implement. Are you trying to prevent people from cheating? This is an entirely different job, and your compliance process will be entirely different. You might, for instance, insist less on punishments and sanctions and explain to people why is it they have to follow the rules. If your job is not to catch people who cheat, but simply to prevent it from happening. Are you on a mission to give a positive image of the company? We will see that when a bank hires people to follow the rules and compliance people, this may not always be to follow the rules, this may not always be to catch the cheaters. It may sometimes because they need to look like they are compliant, they need to look like they are following the rules. This is a public relations issue. Are you simply trying to follow legal requirements? Are you simply trying to follow the rules in the sense of ticking all the boxes one by one? I want you to think back about document 1. Document 1 was an article by a Japanese journalist published in Reuters, and it concerns a recent scandal, an ongoing scandal at a very large company. This is a very famous manufacturing company called Kobe Steel. Kobe Steel is one of the world's most famous and prominent steel manufacturer, and it is particularly famous for the quality of its steel. Now, Kobe Steel recently, in the second quarter of 2017, has been caught falsifying test results in a way that now some of the materials published by Kobe Steel, some of the materials manufactured by Kobe Steel, which are used to build skyscrapers and bridges and cars, may not be of the quality that we expect from Kobe Steel, and they may also not be of the quality that they say they are, right? So this is obviously a very, very serious issue. What happened here, we don't know yet because the investigation is not finished, as you know if you have read document 1, which is a short and relatively interesting piece of article. But what is it that happened? Was there not enough compliance people? Were these people simply trying to prevent cheating, but if cheating happened, there was no one to try and catch the cheaters? Or is it now simply that the people breached the rules for external reasons? They were lazy, they had unreasonable objectives, they were trying to reach certain targets that were unreasonable. But the senior officers who now we know are implicated and knew about this scandal and this cheating didn't say anything. What is the reason for that? Well, maybe the compliance officer trained the operation managers and the plant managers, but not the senior officials in the company who they were supposed to train as well. So when you have to think about who is your audience and what is it that you're trying to do, you need to think slightly outside the box. And it's not simply because your job is to make sure that the 3 traders or the 3 marketing officers you are responsible for comply, that you should maybe stop there. you should take initiative and sometimes go beyond that and think outside the box and think outside the very limited perimeter of your job responsibilities to try and really make sure that your objectives, what you are trying to do, are effectively attained. Now, if you look at this list of what is it that you're trying to do, I'm going to ask you to think for a second of document 2. Document 2 was a TED Talk. TED is a series of lectures and talks by generally people who are considered good speakers, engaging speakers, who have interesting ideas or very interesting ways of maybe simplifying things or explaining things or giving a new perspective on things. Now, this is by your professor of behavioral economics, so someone who is interested in how people like you and I are sometimes irrational. This is something that economists are fascinated with. The fact that sometimes people make wrong calculation or do not make the calculation that if you were thinking about it, not on the spur of the moment, you would make. You would simply calculate maybe the risk, the rewards, the benefits, and make a rational decision. Well, we're not like that. We're humans. We're full of faults and problems that we bring to the table when we make decisions, and a lot of our decisions are imperfect at best. Of course, what he says in these experiments that he's done is that sometimes people would cheat less for reasons that aren't always particularly clear. And mostly, more interesting, people will cheat less or will not cheat for reasons that seemingly have nothing to do with the cheating in itself. So one example that he gave is that when you ask people to swear the honor code or to swear, for instance, on the Bible, they tend to make a better decision and to cheat less. Now, this is an extremely interesting thing because sometimes there is no honor code. There is absolutely no thing as an honor code, meaning a code that would engage your responsibility as the student of the university. And yet when you ask people to swear on this, they suddenly become more compliant, which is a very interesting thing happening in the world of compliance. Of course, he doesn't necessarily talk directly and immediately about compliance, but he takes these issues and brings them to the table. And towards the end of the video, he talks about the stock market and says, well, what does that tell us exactly about the stock market? Let's think about it. I also invite you to think about these issues in terms of the financial services in which we are looking at, the professional world in which we are looking at, even though sometimes these issues are simply introduced as economic or psychological. What we also learn from him and from his experiments and his relatively funny topics and research subjects is that as a compliance officer, you have to become a specialist of cheating. You have to really fully understand what are all the factors that are taken into account by people when they decide to cheat or when they are at a risk of cheating. And that's the reason I included this video into today's lecture, right? We are moving on, and if you want to move with me to slide number 10, which introduces the third part of our how to design processes question. Is there something already in place which you can use? Move with me to slide 11, and you will see that I extracted from the ISO guidelines, the International Standard for Compliance Management, published by a standard organization, the basic chart for any compliance process. Do not try to reinvent the wheel. If there is already something in place for anti-money laundering, for health and safety compliance, or for antitrust compliance, you should probably use that as a basis and wonder, should I use that? Is this a good chart? Is this insufficient? Is this adapted or not? And especially this chart that I put at slide number 11 is really the basis for pretty much any kind of compliance program. Plan, do, check, and act are really the four methods used for the four-step method, which is used for any kind of corporate compliance standard. So please do remember how to design processes very often by utilizing something that's already in place, especially if it's a standard and it's been developed for you to help you as a compliance officer, as an analyst, to simply get a better head start, to not try to reinvent the wheel. We're now moving to the second part of our lecture, which is the dangers of focusing on processes. I want to give you several examples of the blind compliance officer. Examples of blind compliance officers, document number 4, Paradise Papers. And I hope this is not the first time you have heard of Paradise Papers, but the Paradise Papers are a scandal that came to light last year when all the documents of a law firm, a very prominent offshore law firm called Appleby, which has an office in Hong Kong and is a very prominent legal advisor to many, many large companies and other law firms in Hong Kong for any offshore issue. Offshore means jurisdictions such as the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, Gibraltar. All these places have legal system that allows you sometimes to benefit from more privacy or from a more advantageous tax system, and for that you need special lawyers who are specialized of these jurisdictions. This is an offshore law firm. Appleby is an offshore law firm. All the documents were leaked by a consortium of journalists called the Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and this scandal had many consequences. There is no time or space today to detail that, but if you are interested in what's happening really in the financial services sector, please take a moment to look at the Paradise Papers. What we have in document number 4 is one of the latest revelations of the Paradise Papers. Appleby, the law firm, prominent, serious law firm, not the kind of people you would expect to play around compliance rules, has effectively advised a bank that is accused of working for terrorists. That was public information that this bank was linked to terrorism financing. No serious law firm should have been working with them, and yet the bank now stands accused, the law firm now stands accused of having worked with this bank for several months before their compliance mechanism finally kicked in, and their compliance and risk department decided to stop the relationship with this bank. The blind compliance officer. Look now at document number 5, which is an interesting column by Jake Van der Kamp. Jake Van der Kamp is a columnist working for the South China Morning Post, and he's often writing about money laundering in Hong Kong. What he is putting in document number 5, a very recent column published by the South China Morning Post, is his assumption that there is a lot of money laundering going on in Hong Kong. Actually, what he explains, in fact, is that on any given day, 150% of the GDP of Hong Kong is moving out of Hong Kong and moving in of Hong Kong. This is a lot of money. Any normal jurisdiction would see capital movements of between 5, 10, 15% of the GDP. In Hong Kong, sometimes 150% of the GDP comes in Hong Kong, 150% comes out of Hong Kong, and this is on a normal day. What does that mean? That means money laundering. That is the most likely, simplest explanation for such large capital movements. And yet, this happens despite thousands of people in Hong Kong working on anti-money laundering processes and strategies. Are they blind? What's happening here? The third document for today is about Steve Cohen. Steve Cohen is a very famous hedge fund manager, an American, whose hedge fund, based in Stamford, Connecticut, right next to New York, has been disbanded after he was barred from trading securities. So Steve Cohen was caught in a scandal because he personally was accused of failing to catch one of his traders, someone called Mr. Mortimer, from doing what we call insider trading, which is to get inside information before trading stocks, buying and selling securities into a company, of a company. This is interesting because Steve Cohen is a very famous figure in financial services. He's a very bigger than life character, high in color, and is very recognizable person in the financial services sector. What we see here is that he himself, one of the most experienced person in Wall Street, has been accused of being asleep at the wheel, of being a blind compliance officer. Right? Extremely interesting too that his new hedge funds, now that he has won his legal battles against the Department of Justice, will have an army of 50 people constantly spying on every single person who trades at the hedge fund. 50 people constantly listening to calls, reading emails, and trying to understand what is it exactly that the traders are doing. Are they doing something that they shouldn't do? So what he has done is going from a blind compliance officer to a complete spy on his own employees. This is very recent news, this is a very interesting development, and this might trigger a new wave of hedge funds and banks having people constantly listening to phone calls and reading emails, effectively spying. We move on very quickly, if you want to move in with me, to slide 13. The dangers of focusing on processes is also that you can take into account all of these factors, the reasons why people are blind, the rules are bad, people are way too focused on processes, the rules are not supposed to be followed, such as maybe some anti-monopoly rules in Hong Kong are not really designed to catch anti-monopoly behavior, or some anti-money laundering rules in Hong Kong are not really designed to catch money laundering. We can take into account all of that, including the fact that some people are irrational, but we must also think about the organization. And for that, we have document number 7, which is a long academic article. Of course, I'm only asking you to read pages number 1 and 2, the introduction. If you're interested in this aspect of compliance, please read the entire article. It's fascinating. Donald Langevoort is, of course, a big name in compliance, and what he has brought into compliance is really the idea of behavioral compliance. You can't really do compliance if you don't take into account the fact that people behave in a certain way. People are imperfect. Now, what's the difference with the TED Talk we had previously? Well, this article by Donald Langevoort is really about you can't just take the brain, the individual, the psychology. You also have to take what we call the sociology of organizations into account, which is the fact that people behave in a certain way as part of a group. Certain organizations behave as a certain way because they are part of a group of organizations. And the environment around the person also matters for compliance. Of course, psychologists tell us to look outside the individual, and even psychologists who are normally in charge of the individual, the group, the brain, are also telling us, look for reasons in the group, look for reasons in the organization, right? Move with me to slide number 14. The last part of today's lecture is really compliance as a goal. How can you avoid all of these traps? How can you avoid being trapped by psychology, by imperfect human behavior? How can you avoid being caught into being a blind compliance officer because the rules you're given are bad, because you don't have the level, the experience necessary to really do what's right, because the organization you're working with is in itself not compliant, because you're only here to prevent cheating, but cheating is happening and it's not your job to catch people. How to prevent that? Better compliance in recent years has emerged as something really focused on individual responsibility. Document number 8 of today's reading list is what we call the Yates Memo. Sally Yates was the Deputy Attorney General for the United States Department of Justice. She's also famous because she was fired by Donald Trump for refusing to enforce his policies at the very beginning of his administration. But before that, she worked for Barack Obama as number 2 of the Department of Justice, and she wrote a memo that is a very famous memo called the Yates Memo. The Yates Memo effectively tells us that individuals should be held accountable for their role in corporate wrongdoing. How does she phrase it? She says one of the most effective ways to combat corporate misconduct is by seeking accountability from the individuals who perpetrated the wrongdoing. This is the beginning of the memo, and the rest of the memo is effectively how to achieve that. What are the difficulties, how to circumvent them, where should you focus, how do you effectively achieve individual responsibility. This is very interesting because this really changed the way we think about punishment. This really changed the way we think about compliance in general. Even in Hong Kong, in my legal department, at my law firm, we have several times referred to the Yates memo as something to take into account when we give advice about risks, about management, about punishments, and about sanctions. Do not move away from this lecture without having read the Yates memo, and do not underestimate the impact of the memo on corporate responsibility in Hong Kong. The new head of enforcement of the Securities and Futures Commission, the Hong Kong Financial Services Watchdog, has himself referred to the Yates memo and explained that he will go after individuals and he will seek personal individual responsibility in cases of wrongdoing. The Yates memo has an impact around the world, and particularly in places like Hong Kong, which are always looking for guidance in other financial centers. Document number 9 is something that looks at the limits of responsibility. And this is a second story about Steve Cohen, and we'll go back to Steve Cohen once in a while in this semester's lectures. Here, Steve Cohen seemed to have gotten away with responsibility, right? The Department of Justice actions to try and stop him from ever being in charge of money and managing and hedge funds and trading have failed because all they could get was a settlement, and as part of the settlement, he can go back to opening a hedge fund, which is what the Department of Justice originally wanted to avoid because they wanted to hold him accountable. There are two sides to this story. First one, failure of the Department of Justice. Not much success here because he will go back to trading. The second side of the same story is to think about the previous documents we've had with Steve Cohen. Document number 6, in which we saw that now at Steve Cohen's hedge funds, Point72, that's the name of the hedge fund, there will be an army of 50 compliance people like you, like me, listening to phone calls, reading emails, reading WhatsApp messages in real time, trying to not just tick the boxes, but to catch people who cheat. Think about it. Sometimes a story can have two meanings. Steve Cohen, as an individual going back to trading, might look like a failure of corporate responsibility, but effectively this has changed the way we really do compliance, and as I said, this might become a new trend in financial services. Our last part for today, this is section B, and I'm asking you to go with me to slide 15, is in compliance as a goal, leniency and self-reporting, the science of incentives. You need to incentivize people so that they comply. You need to give them something. I put the image of the fat cat, right, which is what the Competition Commission of Hong Kong, the new regulator in charge of enforcing competition law, has chosen as a mascot to represent the cheater, right? To take out the cat means to catch a cheater. The fat cat is supposed to be this rich individual who made lots of money out of the economy of Hong Kong, right? Maybe a tycoon, maybe someone who is corrupt, who doesn't follow the rules. That's the cat, right? So the cat is the one you want to catch. Now, how to catch that? Well, you've looked at document number 10, and again, I'm only asking you to read the introduction, not the entire guidelines on leniency and leniency policy of the Competition Commission. But document number 10 tells us a couple of interesting things. There are rules out there to catch people, which is not just about stick and hitting people and trying to hit them with sanctions or scare them. There are rules out there to try and catch people based on the carrot. Give something to people, not just the stick, but the carrot. For instance, immunity. And you have that in the Yates memo in document number 8 as well. Immunity, what does that mean? I mean, the first person who comes and tells you about compliance breach, an issue, something illegal, something happened, corruption, anti-money laundering, maybe breach of sanctions, breach of international sanctions, anti-terrorism rules, maybe a cartel, breach of anti-monopoly rules. The first person who comes and speaks to the government, the first person who goes to the police, maybe gets a free pass. What does that mean? No responsibility for that person. As long as you cooperate, as long as you genuinely give all the information and all the documents you have, you get away with it. Why? Because the government would rather catch 3, 4, 5% than none. So they might not catch you, but all the people that you will give information to as a company, these are the people that the government is going to be able to catch, that they would not have heard about without you going there and giving all the information you have. And how does that work? It's psychology. You want to be the first one, because complete immunity is only for the first person who speaks to government, the first company. So what do you want to do? You want to be the first one. So whenever you find something at these companies and you're the compliance officer, what do? You tell to the company, you say, we should go and speak to government now. We don't necessarily have time to think about the risk. We don't necessarily have time to think about the cost-benefit analysis. It is about being the first. That is interesting because it shows you that psychology of organization, and behavioral compliance that we spoke about is not just about you, the compliance officer. It is also about the police and the regulators, the people who have to catch the cheaters. They also know about psychology, and they will use it. They will use it to prevent, to deter, and to catch cheating and cheaters. That's it for today. This was a short lecture, but again, we had to flip the classroom, give you the opportunity to do it at your own speed, your own rhythm. Maybe play this recording again if you wish so. This will be online for only a week, so please extract it from YouTube if you want to keep that video with you. But otherwise, play it a second time if you have time to do so and you still have questions or points you want to get back to. And do write to me on the last line. You have my email if you have any questions, if there's anything you want to know about today's lecture or anything else. One last thing before I go, I would like to clarify that this week's readings, which are mostly press articles, are also here to incentivize you to read the news. Read the news in an active way. Find your favorite newspaper. Is it Reuters? Is it Business Insider? Is it Bloomberg? Find the source of information that you prefer, the format, the colors, the language, style, and stick to it. Sign up for their newsletter. All of the news that we use today for our reading list are free. Sign up for their newsletters, regularly visit their website, download their app, and really start to get interested and take an interest in the world we live in. Take an interest in the world of financial services and compliance, because this will help you. This will help you this semester for the rest of your studies, and this will certainly help you to get your first job. If you have any questions, let me know. And otherwise, it was my pleasure to be with you this week, and I shall be with you in person next week. Goodbye.